Judge James Hamilton stepped into his small, dimly lit courtroom, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the docket for the day. The sound of gavel strikes echoed softly from the adjoining chambers, signaling the start of yet another busy morning. As usual, it was a mix of routine cases, speeding tickets, parking violations, and the occasional red light infraction. He had seen it all and dealt with it all. He was known for being strict, efficient, and no nonsense. His reputation as a judge who didn't tolerate excuses had made him a fixture in the local judicial system for over 15 years. Today, the proceedings felt just like any other. The room buzzed with the quiet hum of murmured conversations between clerks, defendants, and their lawyers. Judge Hamilton glanced at the clock above the bench. It was almost time to begin. He adjusted the papers in front of him, preparing himself mentally for the flow of cases he already memorized. He didn't need to look at names. He knew who was coming through the door and what they were there for. The door swung open, and the first defendant stepped forward, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Turner. Dressed in a plain black blouse and slacks, she was a striking figure. Her posture was perfect, her face calm, but her presence unmistakable. She moved with quiet confidence, like someone who was used to commanding attention without demanding it. Hamilton looked up, noting that her uniform, typically worn by those of her rank, was absent. There was nothing in her appearance that screamed military officer, and it didn't cross his mind to consider her background beyond what he saw before him. A woman with a speeding ticket. Lieutenant Colonel Turner. He called out, the formality of his title ringing through the room. She nodded slightly, stepping forward as if on autopilot, her eyes meeting his briefly before focusing on the desk in front of her. Her composed expression remained unchanged. "You're here for a speeding violation," Hamilton began, his voice calm and authoritative. "Can you explain your actions?" Turner took a deep breath, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I was driving to a meeting, and I was a few minutes behind schedule. I understand the violation, and I take full responsibility." Hamilton nodded, briefly glancing down at the paperwork before him. He skimmed over the details, the time, the location, the speed. It was all standard procedure. The fine was set. The ticket was issued. There was nothing extraordinary about this case, and Hamilton was already thinking ahead to the next. "Based on the information here, I'm going to fine you $150, Hamilton said firmly, not looking up from his papers. "You'll have to pay within 30 days, or there will be additional consequences." Turner nodded in acknowledgement, her face neutral. She didn't protest, didn't flinch at the fine. She simply stood there, waiting for the next step, like a soldier awaiting orders. The entire exchange lasted only a few minutes, but for Judge Hamilton, it was just another case, another quick decision in a long line of trivial matters. He gave her a brief nod to signal the end of the hearing. As Turner began to walk away, her head held high, Hamilton's attention was already moving to the next defendant, who had just been called to the stand. But little did he know, this routine moment would soon spiral into something much more complex, and he would soon find himself faced with the most unexpected turn of events of his career. Judge Hamilton stood motionless for a moment, his mind racing. The courtroom, which had felt so familiar and routine moments ago, now seemed suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. He was processing the revelation with increasing disbelief. Chief of Operations for the U.S. Army. How had he not known? How had he missed it? He glanced around the room, his gaze briefly falling on the other defendants waiting their turn. The cases continued as usual, but for Hamilton, nothing seemed normal anymore. He glanced at the clock. Only a few minutes had passed since Turner's hearing, but it felt like hours. The room had an almost eerie quiet as he turned his attention back to his clerk, who was still standing by his side, looking expectantly at him. "You're sure about this?" Hamilton asked quietly, trying to regain his composure. His voice, usually firm and steady, now carried a hint of uncertainty. The clerk nodded, shifting nervously. "Yes, Judge. I just checked. Lieutenant Colonel Turner is one of the highest-ranking women in the Army. She's been in command of military operations at a national level for years. Hamilton felt a wave of heat rush to his face. His hands tightened around the gavel in front of him as a cold realization swept over him. He had just fined one of the most powerful military leaders in the country for a trivial infraction, assuming she was just another average citizen. His mind raced back to the courtroom exchange. The woman who had stood before him was calm, collected, and entirely professional, but she had never once mentioned her title or rank. She hadn't seemed to expect any special treatment, and yet, in that moment, Hamilton had dismissed her as just another speeding ticket violator. What kind of judgment had he passed in his haste? What kind of misstep had he made by not recognizing her importance? He didn't have time to dwell on it. The judge could feel his heart begin to beat faster as he glanced toward the door. Turner had already left the courtroom, her presence gone as quickly as it had arrived. Hamilton felt a pang of regret and guilt that he wasn't sure how to fix. Should he call her back? Should he apologize? But he knew that an apology alone couldn't undo what had just happened. The mistake was too big for that. The courtroom had fallen into its usual rhythm again, but for Hamilton, everything had changed. His actions, so swift and decisive moments ago, now seemed reckless and thoughtless. He could feel the eyes of his court staff on him, their quiet glances acknowledging the weight of the mistake. A few minutes passed, and Hamilton knew he needed to act. He couldn't let the moment slip by. But how could he face Turner now, knowing he had treated her with such disregard? He pushed the papers aside, standing up quickly. His thoughts were a blur, but there was one thing he was certain of. He couldn't let this go. He had to find her. He had to make it right. Judge Hamilton barely had time to steady himself before he was already moving. His feet carried him quickly toward the courtroom door, his mind whirling with the consequences of his actions. He had to find Lieutenant Colonel Turner. He had to speak with her, apologize at the very least for his oversight. But the more he thought about it, the more the situation unraveled in his mind. How could he have been so unaware of who she was? How could he have dismissed her with such authority when she was a person of immense responsibility? As he exited the courtroom and entered the hallway, the courthouse felt different. The noise, the usual sounds of clerks talking, attorneys huddled together, seemed muffled now. It all felt distant, as if the air was thick with the weight of his mistake. He moved quickly, asking the first employee he saw if they knew where Lieutenant Colonel Turner had gone. "She left the building a few minutes ago," the employee replied, offering a sympathetic glance. She didn't look like she was in a hurry, but she didn't seem to expect anything out of the ordinary. Hamilton's frustration grew. He had acted without thought, and now the opportunity to make things right seemed to be slipping away. He checked his watch and realized that Turner, despite her calm and composed demeanor, was likely already far beyond the courthouse by now. She had made it clear she wasn't the type to demand attention or special treatment, and that only made him feel worse. She had accepted the fine, processed it with the professionalism that Hamilton should have shown, and left. The realization was sharp. He had been blind to who she truly was, and even now, the idea of confronting her made him feel exposed. How could he stand in front of someone so accomplished, someone who had earned her place among the highest ranks of the U.S. military, and explain that he had failed to see her as anything more than a simple ticket holder? He walked to the back office, where he hoped to catch up with her before she left the building entirely. There, he encountered a clerk who had been sorting through files. He didn't have to ask twice before the clerk spoke up. "I believe she went to the Army Liaison Office. It's a few blocks away from here." Hamilton's heart sank. The Army Liaison Office was a military-only facility, which meant that once Turner stepped inside, it would be nearly impossible for him to reach her. But there was no turning back now. He had to try, if only to offer an apology. Determined, Hamilton left the courthouse, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. He quickly flagged a cab, instructing the driver to head toward the Army Liaison Office. His mind ran through the potential conversation. Would she even listen to him? Would she brush him off completely? Or perhaps worse, would she see his apology as yet another sign of a system that had failed to respect her in the first place? As the cab made its way down the road, Hamilton couldn't help but wonder, was this just a simple misunderstanding, or was this a reflection of something much deeper, something ingrained in the way he, and perhaps society at large, saw people who didn't look or act the way he was used to? He leaned back in the seat, a knot forming in his stomach, knowing that whatever happened next would change him. The cab ride to the Army liaison office felt interminable. As the streets passed by in a blur, Judge Hamilton's thoughts were trapped in a cycle of self-reproach. His mind kept returning to the moment in the courtroom, the way he had dismissed Lieutenant Colonel Turner without so much as a second thought. In his years of experience, he had prided himself on being quick to make decisions, never hesitating or questioning his authority. But now, in the harsh light of hindsight, he could see how his haste had led him astray. The weight of his mistake pressed on him harder with each passing minute. Hamilton's eyes closed briefly as the cab turned onto a busy street, and he saw his reflection in the window. He barely recognized the face staring back at him. The usually confident and controlled judge was now filled with doubt and regret. The realization that he had treated someone of Turner's caliber with such carelessness gnawed at him. In a courtroom full of minor infractions and petty disputes, it was easy to forget the real people who came through the door. The people with stories far beyond the immediate issue at hand. People like Lieutenant Colonel Turner, who were shaping the future of the country while he sat in judgment over speeding tickets. He wondered how many times he had been blind to the deeper stories of those in his court. Was this a pattern, a blind spot in his own perception? He had acted with authority, but he hadn't thought about the person standing in front of him. He hadn't even considered who she might be. Not truly. Now that ignorance was staring him in the face. How many others had he misjudged in similar ways over the years, assuming they were just like everyone else, because of their appearance, their demeanor, or their status? The cab came to a stop in front of the Army liaison office. Hamilton paved the driver, his hands unsteady, and stepped out onto the curb. The building before him was imposing yet unremarkable. Stark, military-style architecture with a guarded atmosphere. As he approached the door, his nerves started to get the best of him. Would Turner even speak to him? Or would she refuse his apology entirely, seeing it as another display of his disregard? He entered the building with a deep breath, walking through security and approaching the front desk. The receptionist, a woman in a crisp uniform, looked up as he arrived. "I'm here to see Lieutenant Colonel Mariah Turner," Hamilton said, his voice unsteady. "I need to speak with her." The receptionist nodded but didn't seem entirely surprised. "Lieutenant Colonel Turner left for the day, but I can have her contact you if you'd like to leave a message." Hamilton felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He had come all this way, only to find that she was no longer here. It was likely she had already returned to her duties, her schedule too demanding to make room for a judge who had treated her with such casual disrespect. "No, thank you," he replied quietly. I'll wait for her call." The receptionist nodded again, and Hamilton found a seat in the corner of the waiting area, feeling the weight of the moment. It had been far easier to make quick judgments from the comfort of his courtroom, but now that he was faced with the reality of his actions, he understood just how much damage a hasty decision could cause. His actions had consequences far beyond the fine he had issued. It wasn't just about a speeding ticket, it was about respect, recognition, and seeing people for who they truly were, not just as they appeared in the moment. Hamilton sat quietly, his heart heavy with the knowledge that no matter how sincere his apology might be, he could never take back the first impression he had left on Lieutenant Colonel Turner. The reality of his error settled in, and he understood, more than ever, the importance of careful consideration, humility, and respect in the decisions he made as a judge. The hours in the Army liaison office felt like days to Judge Hamilton. He waited, staring at the clock, each minute slipping by with increasing discomfort. His thoughts continued to churn, replaying every detail of his earlier actions. He had assumed too much, had acted on autopilot, using his position to quickly dismiss someone without understanding who she really was. The thought of facing Lieutenant Colonel Turner again, if only to offer an apology, made him uneasy. He knew that words alone wouldn't undo the damage, and yet he couldn't leave without trying. Finally, around mid-afternoon, Hamilton's phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but he didn't hesitate to answer. "Judge Hamilton," a calm voice asked on the other end. "Yes, this is he replied, trying to steady his breathing. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Maria Turner. I understand you were looking for me." Hamilton's heart skipped a beat. He had expected her to perhaps ignore him or delegate the matter to someone else. Instead, she was calling him directly. Hamilton's voice faltered for a moment. "I wanted to apologize, Lieutenant Colonel Turner. I made a mistake earlier today. I didn't realize who you were, and I treated you with disrespect. I should have shown more care, and I'm truly sorry." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Hamilton braced himself for any number of responses. Perhaps she would brush him off. Perhaps she would be indifferent. But the reply he received surprised him. "I appreciate you reaching out, Judge Hamilton." Turner's voice was measured but warm. "But I want you to understand something. I wasn't offended by your actions. I'm used to people underestimating me because of how I look or what I wear. It's something I've learned to accept, and frankly, I don't let it bother me. But I do appreciate your sincerity." Hamilton felt a weight lift slightly off his shoulders. It wasn't that Turner had excused his mistake, but her response gave him a small measure of relief. She wasn't angry, and that gave him a chance to move forward. "I understand that I made an error, and I'm committed to being more aware in the future," he said, his voice firm. "You deserve to be recognized for who you are and what you've accomplished, not just for what others see in the moment." There was another pause, but this time it felt lighter, more thoughtful. "Thank you, Judge Hamilton," Turner replied. "I hope that your experience today helps you see things from a different perspective. In the end, we're all just people trying to do our best." Hamilton smiled faintly, the words sinking in deeper than he expected. It was an exchange that was far more meaningful than he had anticipated. She hadn't just accepted his apology. She had offered him insight, a chance to grow, and a reminder of how easy it was to overlook people based on preconceived notions. "Thank you for understanding," Hamilton said, "and I won't forget this lesson. I'll be more careful in the future." "You're welcome, Judge," Turner replied before the call ended, her tone resolute yet calm. "Take care." As Hamilton hung up the phone, he sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in. He had been given a rare opportunity to learn, to reflect, and to be better. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of humility that he had rarely experienced before. It wasn't just about being a judge, it was about being a person who could see beyond the surface, someone who could offer respect where it was due, no matter who was standing in front of him. The news of Judge Hamilton's oversight and subsequent apology spread quickly, as stories of unexpected encounters often do. Within hours, local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as an important reminder of the need for awareness and respect in all areas of life, particularly within the justice system. It was a human interest piece that captured the attention of people from all walks of life. But what truly captivated the public wasn't just the apology. It was the revelation of who Lieutenant Colonel Maria Turner truly was. In a small town where people didn't often rub shoulders with high-ranking military officers, the story was a sensation. The notion that a woman of Turner's stature had been dismissed so casually by a judge, only for the judge to later realize his mistake, seemed almost unbelievable. The media ran with it, interviewing local residents, legal experts, and military personnel. Many expressed surprise at how quickly the judge had admitted his error, but even more were taken aback by the contrast between Turner's composed presence in the courtroom and her remarkable career. It was the story of an unlikely encounter, an ordinary moment, hidden in the flow of routine judicial procedures, turned into something much larger. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Turner was one of service, leadership, and quiet strength, and now it was being told in households across the country. People were amazed to learn about her role in coordinating critical military operations, how she had risen through the ranks, and how, despite her accomplishments, she had never once made a claim to special treatment. Her humility, coupled with the judge's acknowledgement of his mistake, resonated with many. Even more remarkable was Turner's response to the public attention. She didn't seek it out. She didn't relish in it. Instead, she spoke about her dedication to her work and the importance of leadership that focused on service, not ego. In interviews, Turner made it clear that her goal had always been to lead by example, to be someone who worked alongside her peers, not above them. Her calm demeanor in the courtroom wasn't just an act of professionalism. It was an embodiment of how she approached every aspect of her life. For Judge Hamilton, the media storm was an uncomfortable but necessary consequence of his actions. His initial mistake had catapulted him into the public eye, and for the first time, he found himself reflecting not just on the apology he had made, but on the larger issues of systemic oversight and prejudice. He had underestimated someone in his court, someone who had earned her position through hard work and sacrifice. But he had also learned the importance of seeing people as more than they seemed on the surface. In interviews, Hamilton spoke openly about his error, acknowledging that this incident had challenged his perception of authority and respect. He admitted that it was easy to fall into the trap of judging people based on superficial traits, especially when he had been in his position of power for so long. But the lessons he had learned, both from his own mistake and from Turner's graceful response, had given him a new perspective on fairness, humility, and the human side of justice. By the time the story had fully circulated, it was no longer just about a judge and a military officer. It had become a story of growth, reflection, and a chance to break through the assumptions that often cloud our judgment. It wasn't just Turner's story or Hamilton's. It was a collective lesson for everyone who heard it. Months passed, and the story of Judge Hamilton's mistake and Lieutenant Colonel Mariah Turner's graceful response continued to resonate within the community. For Hamilton, the experience had marked a profound shift in how he approached his work, and more importantly, how he viewed those who came before him in his courtroom. He made a deliberate effort to change, to slow down, to listen more carefully, and to look beyond the surface. His interactions with defendants, plaintiffs, and even attorneys became more thoughtful. He began to ask questions that revealed more than just the facts of a case. He sought to understand the people behind the legal issues. He still upheld the law with firmness, but his judgments became infused with a new depth, one that recognized the value and humanity in everyone who stood before him. Hamilton took part in seminars on bias, fairness, and leadership, something he had never considered before the incident with Turner. The experience had opened his eyes to the importance of understanding the diverse backgrounds, identities, and struggles that people brought into his courtroom. He knew that his role was not just to deliver judgment based on legal codes, but to ensure that justice, in its truest form, was fair and impartial to all. At the same time, Turner continued to excel in her military career. The story of her encounter with Judge Hamilton had not only brought attention to her role in the military, but had sparked deeper conversations about the challenges women face in leadership roles, particularly in male-dominated fields like the armed forces. She was invited to speak at conferences, write articles, and mentor young women who aspired to follow in her footsteps. Despite the recognition, Turner remained focused on her work, never losing sight of the mission and the people she served. The two never met again after that fateful day in the courtroom, but their brief encounter had left a lasting impression on both. Turner had become a symbol of grace under pressure, her ability to navigate difficult situations with dignity and poise earning her respect from all sides. And Hamilton, in turn, had become a more reflective judge, one who understood the importance of humility, the dangers of assumptions, and the need to see the full picture before making a decision. In the months following the incident, Hamilton received numerous letters, some from people in his community, some from complete strangers, thanking him for his openness and willingness to admit his mistake. It wasn't just the apology that had made an impact, it was his willingness to grow and learn from the experience. People respected the fact that he didn't shy away from his error, but instead used it as an opportunity for self-improvement. And though Turner never sought any accolades for her role in the story, her quiet strength had made a powerful statement. She had shown the world that leadership wasn't about power or recognition. It was about serving others and handling challenges with grace. In many ways, her example had transformed the way people viewed not just her, but the very concept of leadership itself. For both Hamilton and Turner, that one brief moment in the courtroom had become more than just an isolated incident. It had sparked a journey of growth, reflection, and lasting change. It had reminded them, and those who witnessed it, that the most important lessons are often the ones we learn when we step outside our own assumptions and take the time to truly see the people around us. As Lieutenant Colonel Turner turned to leave the courtroom, Judge Hamilton's attention quickly shifted to the next defendant. The courtroom resumed its usual murmur, the low sound of voices blending with the shuffle of feet. The next case was a minor parking violation, something Hamilton could easily dispose of with a few words. His mind was already moving on to the next routine decision. Turner, however, did not leave in a hurry. She paused at the side of the room, collecting her things, papers, a pen, and a military-style briefcase that hung at her side. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her actions, but to someone paying attention, her composed demeanor was almost striking in contrast to the chaos of the court. She wasn't agitated or impatient. She wasn't bothered by the fine or the brief exchange. It was clear that to her, this was just another part of a much larger and more complex world. Judge Hamilton, still focused on the next case, didn't give her much thought. He continued his steady rhythm of ruling on minor violations. He moved from one defendant to the next, the cases blending together in a haze of paperwork and procedural language. But then, just as the judge was about to issue another fine for a broken taillight, he caught a glimpse of something. It wasn't the woman who had just left. He had already dismissed her from his thoughts. It was something smaller, something that caught his eye on the far end of the courtroom. A courthouse clerk, who had been quietly organizing papers at the back, leaned in toward him with a look of quiet urgency. "Judge Hamilton," the clerk whispered, "I think you might want to know something." The judge's eyebrows furrowed slightly, and he looked up. "What is it?" The clerk paused, clearly uncomfortable with the task at hand, then spoke with careful consideration. "The woman who just left, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Turner. She's not just any defendant. She's the Chief of Operations for the U.S. Army." The words hung in the air for a moment as Judge Hamilton processed the information. He blinked, his pen hovering above the papers in front of him. His mind raced. Was this some kind of mistake? He had just fined the Chief of Operations for the U.S. Army, a woman who oversaw thousands of soldiers, coordinated national security operations, and played a pivotal role in the military's strategic planning. And he had treated her like any other defendant with a speeding ticket. A cold feeling of realization crept over him. He stood frozen for a moment, his thoughts spiraling into disbelief. How could he have been so unaware? How could he have dismissed her with such casual authority, failing to even consider the person standing before him? The courtroom felt suddenly too small, too tight. The judge looked toward the door where Turner had just exited, his gaze lingering on the empty space she had left behind. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, and for the first time in his career, he felt a sense of doubt. The quick decision he had made without a second thought now seemed like a glaring error. He had been too quick to judge, too eager to move on to the next case, and in doing so, he had overlooked the profound importance of the woman he had just dismissed so casually.